Thank you. We're so glad you're here. The Education Committee is the continuing education arm of the Circle. Our job is to offer programs germane to our mission. This year, we added a new dimension to education in response to timely issues in the news. With the establishment of the study group, participants were able to self-educate by accumulating reading material and meeting with local experts in the field of immigration. It has been quite a journey. The topic of immigration is expansive and comprehensive. With every new administration, laws change and immigrants face new hurdles. Organizations have to remodel their programs to meet the needs of various immigrant populations. Our goal today is to help you understand the history of immigration, help you discern the truth from the myths, and learn what is happening in our own welcoming city. I would like to thank Christy Coe for chairing the Immigration Study Group and her committee who put this panel together. Haya Hemi, Lucia Kersner, Susan Anderson, Margaret Cohn, Phyllis von Stad, Suzanne Lapidus, and Penny Cordish. I would also like to mention the study group led by Mimi Piper and Leslie Gligman on the wealth divide and racial inequalities, which is well on its way to planning the September Full Circle meeting. Next year, we will be choosing 2 other topics to study. We welcome your ideas for topics and your participation in any of the education committees. They are Circle Advocacy, which teaches you how to advocate and helps you resource where to advocate. Circle Reads, which is our book club, and Circle Forum, which highlights grantees, and now Circle Study. We'd love to have you join us. Before we start, I would like to take the next 10 minutes to let you all tackle the citizenship test. If the person holding the materials could pass out the cards and each of you read a question and see if your table mates can answer them. You are now on the clock.
On my left is Heather Benno, who's the managing attorney with Catholic Charities of Baltimore Immigration Legal Services. She oversees the general immigration and crime victim services of the charities. Her job is partly to give us Immigration 101, to let us know some of the real legal aspects and history of this ever increasing, or more in our face, news in Baltimore. To her left is Valerie Twalmuth, Esquire. She's been the director of the Catholic Charities Esperanza Center since 2011. She joined the staff before that in 2007 of Barbara Mikulski and came to us, I think, directly from Barbara, where she worked. She has a big job. She's responsible for the staff of 36 dedicated professionals and direct service staff and approximately 500 volunteers who help support the charity's work annually. Next to her is Eric Seymour. He's the manager of the Client Services Program at the Esperanza Center, where he also oversees the volunteer and outreach programs. Eric has been at the center since 2013, when he started as an AmeriCorps volunteer in their immigrant health services program. And lastly, not from Esperanza, is Catalina Rodriguez Lima, is the director of the Mayor's Office of Immigrant and Multicultural Affairs in Baltimore City. That position was formed under the last mayor. As the director of MEMA, Catalina is responsible for promoting community well-being, economic development, and the inclusion of immigrant and refugee communities into the city of Baltimore. Her office oversees the city's compliance with federal regulations, and in addition, she herself staffs the boards of many of the agencies and commissions in town that have reference immigration. My favorite fact about her is that she was named Best Baltimorean by Baltimore Magazine in 2017 for her efforts in establishing a legal fund to protect immigrant communities from deportation. She's one of those people that can pull your heartstrings and your purse strings at the same time, so watch out for her. She's a native of Ecuador, and she moved to the United States in the year 2000. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Heather to begin.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Penny, Christy, to the entire committee, to the Baltimore Women's Giving Circle for having me join you today, this morning, to discuss what we do in immigration legal services, this crazy world in which we work, and also to give a little bit of context to what exactly is the situation of immigrants who arrive in the United States, and also more specifically who live in the Baltimore area. So in preparing for this presentation, I was thinking, how could I ever boil down immigration law in the United States into 20 minutes? So I decided I would spend 10 minutes talking about the entire history from the founding of our country until 1965, and then 10 minutes from 1965 until today, okay? So that's the level of detail I'll be able to go into, but I'm gonna provide a lot of dates and facts in this presentation, so if you want, and I also at the end have some resources that people can take and look into on their own. Also, I'm available for questions, and I'd be happy to answer any of them. So why are we talking about this? We all hear the questions from the community. Maybe some of us have even asked them ourselves. I know I have. One reason why I became an immigration lawyer is that I myself am first generation born in this country. My parents are Jewish refugees. My father left from Iraq, from Baghdad, and most of my family actually lives in the Middle East. Yet I still, being born in this country and growing up here, didn't have an idea of what my family went through to come here, or some of what laws even applied to my father when he was becoming a citizen. I didn't have any idea until I was working with somebody who had relatives in Iceland, and she was telling me that her elderly mother just could not live with her for more than 6 months out of every year. And that to me just didn't make any sense. Why would we want a scientist gone from this country 6 months out of every year just to take care of her parent? It seems illogical to me at the time. So I wanted to learn about it, and that's one of the reasons why I became an immigration lawyer. But we do hear that. Why don't people just come lawfully? Why don't people do it like my dad did, or like my great-grandfather did? And the truth is that we're going to see that some of the complexity of immigration law, as it has evolved over the years, has resulted in a situation where people, even if you wanted to follow the rules, to cross every T and dot every I, sometimes the law will not support that. Sometimes the law, because of the history of the law, because of the fact that it's a patchwork, which you'll see as we discuss the different changes, and because this patchwork was never intended to really fit together in any rational way. It really was a pendulum that swung over the years to reflect the politics of the time in this country. So if you have different laws with different intent behind each law that change each other, over the years you're going to end up with a system that looks pretty messy. And I think you'll probably see some of that from our discussion today. Almost like a surgery where there are a lot of scars. You'll see that in the immigration law. 245I is a particular provision of the Immigration and Nationality Act, which is a law that I'll cover. And as an immigration lawyer, you need to know that that law essentially is a relic of the past. That the only people who can apply for the green card under 245I are those who had relatives, who had papers in the United States, and who had petitions filed for them prior to April 30th, 2001. Why do I know that date? Because I need to memorize all of these dates in order to understand whether somebody qualifies or not. If the petition was filed May 1st, that person won't qualify. Under the exact same circumstances. There can't be any real, lasting, rational reason for that, but still it exists. And a bunch of the other things too that are on this slide. All of these abbreviations, the alphabet soup that you hear about when you hear about immigration. U visas, T visas, B visas, O visas, Z visas, we call it alphabet soup for a reason. It's hard for people, even attorneys, to stay up to date on everything that is changing in the law. And you certainly wouldn't expect somebody who doesn't speak English, may not have been to college, to understand this level of complexity before they come to this country. So we'll just, in the grand overall scheme of things, start in 1790, when just a couple years after the founding of our country, we had the first attempt to legislate citizenship. Prior to this, Congress actually didn't do anything about immigration and didn't have the power, actually, under the Constitution, because the Constitution gave that power to regulate labor to the states. But eventually, Congress was given the authority to regulate slave trade, which it did, and under this authority, regulated naturalization and proposed rules for naturalization. You can see that even from the very beginning, so some of what we learn about our country's history is not actually accurate, that it wasn't intended to be a bastion for everybody. Maybe some people did intend for that, but the Naturalization Act limited people who came to the United States for applying for citizenship to those who were free and white. And so you can see here that there was no permanent residency, green card, marriage-based, visa interview, anything, actually. It was really just, can you pay for a ticket or find a way to come to the United States? Can you be productive and support yourself for 2 years? Then you can register to become a citizen. Okay, so 9 years later, and I think that this is a theme that you'll see in immigration law generally, there is not too much time that passes before new changes happen. Actually, back then, you can see between 1798 and 1864, there weren't too many changes at all. So there are periods of time when the law basically does stay put, and the changes are made by administrative authority, like the authority of the president or the courts. So in 1798, the Alien and Sedition Acts were passed, and they changed the residence requirement in just 8 years. Think about this. From 2 years to become a citizen to 14 years. 2 years to 14 years. I mean, and we're talking about generally just groups of people. Again, you still didn't have to become a permanent resident before. There were no grounds to exclude you from the United States. It was really just you applied and registered, but this was a period of time when the United States was preparing to go to war, and so was very apprehensive about having any people from other countries living in the country. So part of the Alien and Sedition Acts did limit the speech of immigrants or anybody really who criticized the government's war efforts. In 1864, we have the first Immigration Act, which is when the government actually established, so the first, I guess, predecessor of the former INS. This would be the first commissioner of immigration. So we have almost the first 100 years of existing in this country without really having an agency for immigration at all. In 1882, we have another Immigration Act, which was an extension of the prior one, and that really was the first time that the federal government attempted to broadly provide oversight to immigration. So now there was a commissioner, there was an office, there was a citizenship process, and there were grounds for deportation for people based on speech. But with the 1882 Immigration Act, taxes were levied for each person who was arriving by ship, so there was an effort to fund the immigration system. And the law for the first time actually required that people arriving be screened. And actually they were screened for whether they were convicts, this is not my language, the language of the act, lunatics, idiots, or people unable to take care of him or herself without becoming a public charge. So yes, I'm sorry I have to use that language, but that was the language of the act. And so that was the basis for excluding somebody from this country. You can see serious criminal convictions. We're not talking about, taking somebody's, piece of corn. Something more serious, usually something political, mental illness, or what to date is one of the most important things that the government looks at when looking at somebody's application, whether the person can actually support themselves. The public charge requirement is one of those requirements that still exists today. If immigration believes that you will ever become, within the first 10 years of getting status in this country, eligible for benefits, then you can be denied admission. So, and we're going to talk about myths and facts later, but certainly we do hear a lot of rhetoric about benefits and immigrants, and it's clear that this provision of law from back in 1882 has been very strict. Okay, so now we're going to go into a little bit about racism in immigration, a discussion about the Chinese Exclusion Acts and the Scott Act, which expanded the Chinese Exclusion Acts. And the Supreme Court actually upheld these in Che Changping versus United States. These laws were intended to regulate immigration solely based on race. So you can see not only has immigration law evolved over the years, but also the Constitution has evolved over the years, and our interpretation and ability to apply it has evolved. These type of statutes probably wouldn't fly today under the current structure. But the law literally suspended immigration of any laborer from China for 10 years and only allowed people who were already in the United States as of November 17th, 1880 to stay. So the original act paved the way for later acts that further limited Chinese immigration, and eventually led to a later discussion of who we actually did want in this country and what role Chinese laborers were playing in constructing the railroads. You can see here, I have an image from the original act that actually, if you look at it on your own computer, you can see the language that was actually used to say that we want to exclude people on this basis. And the photo is a photo of somebody who's applying for status, who had already been living in the United States and was trying to show that he had the requisite residence here. That's something that we as immigration attorneys do all the time for people now. We have to show that people have resided here for 10, 15, maybe even 20 years. Okay, so after racial lines, we moved toward focus on quotas from different countries. Starting with the Emergency Quota Act in 1921, but actually I skipped something major. In 1917, and it's not on this list, there was the first Immigration Act that actually created the system that we now understand to include different types of visas. So I haven't talked about visas or green cards before this, and that's because before 1917, they didn't really exist in the way that we understand it now. As I said, it was just registering for citizenship. But in 1917, not only did the act extend prohibitions on the Chinese exclusion laws and create an Asiatic barred zone that covered British India and most of Southeast Asia and the Middle East, but also the law expanded the list of grounds of inadmissibility. Those are the things that I talked about before, you know, the bad words that I didn't like to say. Now the list was expanded to include other people, anarchists specifically. For the first time, people previously deported. So that's important because this whole time from 1790 until 1917, if you were deported for one reason or another, let's say you did become a public charge or you had an illness, you could always reapply and come back. So 1917 actually was the time when that changed. And interestingly, at this time we decided to exclude everybody over the age of 16 who are deemed physically capable of reading but who could not read. So that was a requirement under the 1917 Act as well. So using that system from the 1917 Immigration Act, Congress began to draw quotas. And the first attempt was in 1921, and it limited the number of immigrants from each nationality, interestingly, based on the percentage and number of immigrants from that country present in the United States. So it didn't have to do with how many people lived in that country, it had to do with how many people from that country were already here, and set the percentage to 3%, and based that calculation on the 1910 census. So that is interesting because just a couple of years later, in 1924, due to anti-immigrant sentiment, the quotas were reduced from 3 to 2%, and the census date was changed from using 1910 numbers back to numbers from 1890 to specifically exclude the people who had relatives living in this country during those 30 years. So you can see that this really is, again, the pendulum swinging. We admit people as immigrants, and then historically we tell them maybe there's no way for you to come here lawfully. In 1939, there was a major event, which maybe many people in the room are aware of, the sailing of the St. Louis, which was a ship, German transatlantic ship, bound for Havana, Cuba. Very sad story. 937 people aboard the ship, mostly Jewish people, were applying for visas actually not everybody on the ship were applying to visas to the United States, but over 730 people were. And they only intended to wait for their visas in Cuba because there was a layover time. There was a period of waiting due to this structure. And unfortunately, Cuba decided 1 week prior to the ship arriving, these were people fleeing Nazi persecution, that they would not allow the ship to land, and that they only eventually allowed 28 people to disembark from the ship. The ship was turned away, sailed toward Miami, where they cabled President Roosevelt. They could actually see the lights in Miami, the city lights, and they asked for help. But at the time, due to the act in 1924 and due to public opinion in the United States, which was largely anti-immigrant, 83% of Americans opposed relaxing the restrictions of that 1924 act. And in response, Roosevelt felt like he had no choice, refused to issue an executive order, and did not allow the St. Louis to land in the United States. Most of the people did not end up back in Germany. Thankfully, many European countries did take them in, but some of those European countries were then conquered by Nazi Germany, and the grand majority of the people did perish in World War II. And that was a lesson, I think, to some legislators and the politicians in the United States about the importance of taking responsibility, but you can see that the refugee question still remains today. Just touching briefly on the Bracero Agreement, the focus during this time, during World War II, was on the refugee question and also on labor in the United States. Everybody is off fighting in the war, there's a need for labor, and Congress passes a new law to respond to that. And that's the Bracero Agreement, allowing Mexican nationals to enter the United States as temporary agricultural workers. And this law basically continued and was extended all the way into the mid-60s. So this was actually a recruitment program, recruiting Mexican farm workers to come in and work. Okay, I violated my rule to get to 1965 in 10 minutes, but I'm on the slide, so here I am. I already talked about refugees, so the point here is that during World War II, we did not have any legislation in place in this country to address the issue of people suffering persecution or torture in their home countries. The United Nations had a first convention related to the status of refugees in 1951, and that eventually became the UN Protocol in 1967. But it wasn't until 1980, believe it or not, 1980, that the United States passed the Refugee Act that actually establishes the system that we use now to process asylum applications and refugee applications from abroad. In 1965, the United States, we passed the Immigration and Nationality Act, which sets up essentially the current system. It's the system that we have. There are new things that have been introduced into that system, mostly over the 80s and 90s, but the basic structure remains in place, and that is that there are 3 types of immigrants living in the United States. One category of people who are indefinitely permitted to remain here, or lawful permanent residents. These are people who are indefinitely allowed to work, pay taxes, are permitted by law to petition for their relatives to come, and can travel. So there are a lot of rights associated with that. And I'm talking about non-citizens, okay? So there are obviously immigrants who live in the United States who are US citizens now. But among those who are not, there are also people lawfully present who are not lawful permanent residents. And those are people who are in the categories that I just referenced: asylees, refugees. There are also DACA holders. We hear a lot about that in the news. And today, big news again, there was an order from the federal court in DC, again issuing an injunction. Unfortunately, the injunction is not actually in place yet because there's a 90-day period within which the Department of Homeland Security can respond, providing reasons for the termination of the DACA program. But DACA was one of these programs that allowed youth who came to the United States before the age of 16 and were here on the date that the program was announced, June of 2012, I remember that date because I have to, allowed them to get temporary protection from deportation, work authorization, and these youth could live without fear of being removed from their families. Now, folks who have DACA still are able to renew it, but this most recent decision is about new applications. So it'll be very exciting to see what ends up happening. And then, of course, there are undocumented individuals. So, of that process, how does somebody become a lawful permanent resident? I have here a chart because we talk a lot about the line, waiting your place in line, or, have you waited your place in line before coming here? And this is the line. I actually updated these dates yesterday at around 8 p.m. That means that if you want to apply for your lawful permanent residence through a relative under, completely the appropriate system, you would have had to have applied, if you are from the Philippines and you're getting the visa through your brother, on or before December 15th, 1994. in order to qualify today for your green card. So that is the line. And that's, you can see it changes. The China, mainland-born, India, Mexico, and Philippines is all a relic of these quota systems that I was talking about earlier, and also of the Chinese exclusion laws that created a backlog of Chinese immigrants. So you'll see the dates vary based on country. And then there's just the rest of the world. So there are these countries that have very long waits, and then the rest of the world. And essentially there is no way to step in front of your place in line. You either wait your place and get it, or you're eligible for something else. So I'm just gonna end with a discussion briefly on some of the changes that have taken place since that time until today. And I wanna focus just for my last minute on 1996, which is the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, and also the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. These were two acts that really overhauled the immigration system again, and were built on some of the prior laws that you see there. All a reflection on the war on drugs and the war on crime in this country. And through these years, we created special provisions where certain immigrants, based on a criminal record, were basically had to be detained. So it created a system where even a judge could not decide to release somebody from a detention center. And so the point is that there's this sense that actually people have their day in court. But under the current system, some people don't really have their day in court. And there was a recent article in the New York Times this weekend referencing that approximately 700 children have been separated from their families at the border due to similar policies. Immigration is saying that it's actually in the kids' best interest, that they can't confirm that the adults that are accompanying them are their parents. They might be smugglers, they might be criminals, so why don't we separate them? But you can see it's this removal of discretionary authority, the being told by the immigration agents that you don't have the power to take somebody's humanitarian circumstances into account, that really seals the deal and locks many immigrants into this cycle that we see of deportation and detention. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues, but I encourage you during the question and answer period or after to come up and speak to me. I'd be happy. We at the Esperanza Center really love volunteers, and we need your assistance. Here are just some ideas of ways that you can help us out. Of course, money is always appreciated, but your time and your talents are really important too. So keep that in mind, and thank you so much.
I have to tell you, I have a history of forgetting about my PowerPoint. So if I start going along and I'm saying, look here, and it's not what you're supposed to be seeing, feel free to raise your hand and say, hey, get it together. So I'm here to talk a little bit about unauthorized, undocumented immigrants in America, and particularly in Maryland and in Baltimore, why folks come, the challenges they face while they're here, and what we do at Esperanza. What I should probably mention, as Heather did, is one of the most important things probably about the bio that you heard earlier that I didn't mention, that's most pertinent to our discussion, is that my great-grandparents on my mother's side were immigrants, Jewish immigrants from Russia. On my paternal side, my great-great-parents, great-great-grandparents were effectively immigrants who came around the time of the Mayflower. And my in-laws were immigrants who fled China during the Communist Revolution. I'm sure that all of you have some story in your background of people, relatives who immigrated here, and if you ever have an opportunity to find out more about it, it can be fascinating. So I would strongly encourage it, if you haven't done that already. As you've heard from Heather's presentation, immigration is complicated, incredibly difficult, and it has a monumental effect on an immigrant's life. So why do people make this decision? Why come? I'm going to ask you for just a minute to imagine what circumstances would it take that would compel you to pack up some belongings that you could carry, leave your family and friends, all that is familiar, travel thousands of miles on foot, in the back of a van, a back of a truck, or on top of a train, and I do mean a top of a train, to go to a new country where you don't speak the language, you have no guarantee of work or health care, transportation, or a home of your own. What would it take? Well, these are what we call push-pull factors for people who are immigrants. There are push factors from their home country that they're living with every day. Unemployment, and when I say unemployment, I don't mean, oh, they haven't been able to find a job in a while. I mean, there are no jobs available. So no jobs, no income. A lack of safety. So people may be persecuted for their religion, their race, their political beliefs, any number of things, their gender identity. They're living with violence, with gangs. There may be health issues, there may be epidemics, there may be issues of whether there's potable running water. They may be in a country that is suffering war or civil unrest. They may be isolated. There might have been a natural disaster, an earthquake. And then there are the pull factors, which are what are the factors that exist in another country that exist here that would make people feel compelled to come. And again, there's the potential for unemployment. There's a safer environment where you're not at risk of losing your life on a daily basis. There's a potential for some income, more than you could get, more than nothing in this country. Political security. And for an awful lot of people, there are already friends and family here. Most of the people that we work with at Esperanza are coming to find safety from violence or some opportunities beyond what they had in home country, where most of the time there are none. Just to give you an example, before I get to the numbers, Eric, who speaks fluent Spanish, among other things, he interpreted for a man a few years ago who was seeking asylum in the United States. He had been a police officer in his home country, and he and his fellow officers had arrested a mid-level gang member at some point. One by one, the rest of his police unit were murdered. And he knew that if he stayed, he and his family would be next. So he fled. And you may say, well, why didn't he just move somewhere else? Or there's nowhere else to go. If you are targeted by the gangs in your country, particularly Central America, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, you may say, oh, I'll move to a town 50 miles away. They will find you. So people know they either go or they die. I actually represented a young girl named Gabriela who lived in a shack in El Salvador with her mother and her younger sister. Her mother was considered too old to work because when you have such a small number of jobs available for people, it can be very hard for people who are over a certain age or who may have certain characteristics to find any work at all. So they basically lived on money that was sent to them by relatives who were living in the United States already. Every day, Gabriela said, the gang members would come to the door with machetes to try to encourage them, she and her sister, to join the gang. And she had machete scars on her body to prove it. The gangs were trying to recruit them to work for the gang, to work in the fields, to be drug mules, to prostitute themselves, to get money for the gang. And it finally just got to the point where Gabriela feared for her life, as did her family members, and she made the decision to come to the United States to try to reunite with her sister who lived here. And I'm happy to say that she is now here living with her sister. She's graduated from high school. She's doing very well, wants to go to college, wants to become an immigration attorney. So that's a success story and a happy story, but there are thousands of people in very similar situations to Gabriela for whom that is not the case and who basically die as a result of conditions in their country. So what are we talking about when we're talking about immigrants in the United States and in Maryland? You can see from the numbers here that it's estimated that there are 43 million Americans, 43 million immigrants in the United States. Approximately 22 million of them are of Latin American origin. And then we have numbers here for unauthorized or undocumented immigrants in the United States, and approximately 8.5 million of them are of Latin American origin. And this is largely a result of the conditions that exist in Central America and that have existed for a long time. There are some numbers here relating to DACA, which Heather referred to, as well as temporary protected status, which you've also been hearing in the news. These are folks who actually were here and there was some event that happened in home country, whether it was a natural disaster, a war, civil unrest, extreme violence, earthquakes, people who have been granted the ability to stay, which gave them the ability to work in the United States and to be free of deportation, as Heather talked about, but it didn't confer actual legal status on them. And as you've been hearing in the news lately, there have been executive orders that have been issued, which basically provide that many of those folks, depending upon which country they are from, they will be losing their temporary protected status. So people who've lived here for 20 or more years at times, who've had families here, who've established businesses here, who've worked here, whose lives are here, they are at risk of basically being sent back to a country that they now do not know. The top countries, by the way, for undocumented folks here in the United States are El Salvador, Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, and Korea. And here's just some more numbers for you, and these again are the top countries, both for undocumented folks as well as for other categories of immigrants, many of which Heather talked about. So included in those numbers are children, like Gabriella, who I mentioned, who are considered unaccompanied children. Basically, they have made the journey from Central America, usually El Salvador, Honduras, or Guatemala. They have made the journey to the southern US border unaccompanied by a parent or adult family member. And I'm sure you've heard in the news about these unaccompanied children, particularly in the past 3 years or so, because while prior to 2013, there always have been unaccompanied children who came across the border. Those numbers usually ran between 5,000 and 10,000 unaccompanied children, and they would arrive seeking to reunite with a parent or family member or a friend of the family who were already living here. In 2013, those numbers began to grow exponentially until, I believe you can see from the chart, in 2014, there were almost 58,000 unaccompanied children who arrived at the border, and in 2016, almost 60,000 unaccompanied children who arrived. And these numbers are due primarily to a significant increase in gang violence that is taking place in those countries in Central America. As I mentioned, Gabriella was one of those children, and since 2013, the Esperanza Center has been working hard to provide services for these children, which I will talk with you more about in just a little bit. Once folks arrive, and even for immigrants who've lived here for many years, there are many challenges that they face. Many of these are the same issues that citizens would have who live in poverty in this country, who are living in marginalized communities, who are people of color. Immigrants who come have most times all those same issues to confront, but there are two other major challenges that they also face as a result of language issues and legal status. As you can see from the chart here, challenges also include employment. Most of the time, if you don't have employment authorization, if you're going to try to work, you have to work under the table. You may be working for less, likely working for less than minimum wage. The laws, oftentimes employers don't feel like the laws that govern the rest of us in terms of labor and employment don't seem to apply to immigrants. Many people are exploited. The same thing happens with housing. There are unscrupulous landlords. Immigrants, undocumented immigrants, are not eligible for any public housing. They can't read a lease necessarily, and so trying to find safe, healthy housing is a significant problem. As you'll hear more from Eric's presentation, immigrants are often victimized. People tend to know that many immigrants carry cash on them if they've worked because they either don't know how to or they're afraid of putting money in a bank account, so they are prime targets for mugging and robbery. They're also afraid of law enforcement. As you can imagine, if you're coming from a country where the police are corrupt, where the gangs are in control, law enforcement doesn't help, you're not necessarily going to trust that you can go to law enforcement in this country. So if you're a victim of domestic violence or you're a victim of some other crime, you may be too afraid to call the police, and also afraid because if you call the police, you're afraid that they will contact immigration enforcement and you will be detained and deported. Education is a particularly difficult problem because most of the children who come have often had little formal academic education. So when they come to this country, they're typically placed in school based upon their chronological age, but they may have had, you could have a 14 or 15-year-old who's had 2 or 3 years max of formal education. Imagine trying to learn in a class where not only do you not know the language, but you're dealing with subject matter that is totally unfamiliar to you. It's a recipe for failure. No healthcare access. Undocumented immigrants are not eligible for Medicare, Medicaid, or any of the private insurance under the Affordable Care Act exchanges. Transportation is difficult. There are different requirements for undocumented folks to get a driver's license. Typically, there may be poor public transportation available, and again, we have the language barriers as well. So that brings me to the Esperanza Center. The Esperanza Center has been around for 55 years, providing services to immigrants in the Baltimore region and actually to immigrants throughout the state of Maryland. We provide increasing types of services over the years, as well as expanded the people that we serve. And basically, we have 6 programs. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly, but we encourage you to come for a tour anytime, and we'll be happy to tell you more about what we do. Our 6 programs include client services, of which Eric is our manager. It is basically a catch-all for any help that any of our other programs don't provide, including things like help with making an appointment for a driver's license, helping enroll a child in school, translating documents, helping people apply for passports. Pretty much runs the gamut for anything that we can help with. Educational services, we provide English as a second language classes, citizenship classes, and computer literacy classes. And our ESL classes are actually done on both a formal basis, but also we have an informal program that basically is run by volunteer tutors. We do the training for them, so people don't need any special experience or background to do it, but it's a wonderful program because people can basically drop in and attend as many of the classes as they want to attend and work in very small groups or one-on-one with a tutor. We have a free health clinic. It's the only volunteers in medicine clinic in the state of Maryland. We utilize both staff and volunteer medical providers, and we provide primary care, some specialty care, and dental services for immigrants who are uninsured and uninsurable based upon what I previously described. Then we have immigration legal services, of which Heather is one of our managing attorneys, and we provide humanitarian and family-based immigration legal services to folks. So we do not only consultations with people where we try to determine whether or not they are eligible for any relief, whether there's a visa that they might be eligible for, whether they have some other basis, whether they're eligible for asylum, that sort of thing. And we now have a staff of 10 immigration attorneys who are doing that work. Many of our immigration legal services are done for free, and then we do have some low-cost charges for some of our other services. We have a family reunification program which specifically reunites unaccompanied children coming from Central America with their parent or family member in Maryland. And those services include both assisting what they call the sponsor or the family member with making the application to reunite with the child, but then we also have what we call post-release services where we try to assist the family once the child is here in terms of making the adjustment to living in this country. And then we have services for immigrant victims of human trafficking, both sex trafficking and labor trafficking. This is a significant problem, as you can imagine, as a result of some of the other challenges and barriers that folks face. They are often trafficked as well. And just to show you kind of by the numbers the work that we're doing, in 2017, our fiscal 2017, the Esperanza Center served over 11,500 people. This is with a staff of 37 bi- and multilingual folks, as well as an army of volunteers who help us do the work that we do. And you can see here just in our various different programs some of the numbers of folks that we are serving and getting the services that we offer. We serve immigrants, or did serve in that year in particular, but it's typical that we would have served immigrants from over 100 countries. I believe we've served immigrants from every continent except perhaps Antarctica. And we basically just try to provide a welcoming an environment as we possibly can, all in one location as much as possible. And we will continue to add services, modify our services, and basically do whatever we can possibly do to assist folks in Baltimore and around Maryland to adjusting to the new life here. I'll be available for questions as well, as Heather said, and now I'm happy to turn this portion over to my colleague, Eric Seymour.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for letting me speak. I'd like to give a special thank you to Haya, who I think was the first person who suggested that it'd be okay for a guy to present to the Baltimore Women's Giving Circle. So thank you. So my portion of this presentation we're calling Setting the Record Straight. We had been calling this Myths and Facts, but we decided to change that because to me the word myth has a sort of organic connotation. You know, we don't really know where myths come from. They almost feel accidental. And I think a lot of things that I'll be talking to you about today are not accidental. These are false narratives built on fears that we have of people who are different from us and promoted by people with very specific anti-immigrant agendas. So the first thing I'll talk to you about is the narrative out there that there's a very strong association between undocumented immigration and crime in the United States. If you watch certain news channels or listen to certain politicians, it's hard to hear them talk about undocumented immigration without mentioning crime in the same breath. This to me is one of the most obnoxious and heinous falsehoods that exist about undocumented immigrants. I've been at the Esperanza Center for 5 years now. I can say in those 5 years that I've met well over 1,000 undocumented people, and I don't think that any of them are people who crime is in the forefront of their minds when they're making decisions. And you'll be hard-pressed, at least in my experience, to meet somebody with a higher regard for law enforcement than someone who comes from a place where law enforcement is at worst corrupt and at best ineffective. So you can see there, nationally speaking, in periods of high immigration, those tend to coincide with periods of decreased crime. Quite the opposite is true about this narrative when you think about undocumented people in crime. Not only are they less likely to be perpetrators of crime, they are much more likely to be victims of crime. Val touched on this a little bit, but this happens again for a lot of reasons. First of all, let's say if you were to see me walking down one side of the street tonight and you saw somebody else on the other side, I'm often not wearing a suit, but I am today, and whatever it is about that other person made you think that he or she is undocumented. There's a few reasons that I'm a less attractive target. One, if you mug me, you'll get my wallet, my phone. My wallet, I think today has about $6 in cash in it. Credit cards, which I will cancel as soon as I can. But if you mug that person that for whatever reason you assume or you believe them to be undocumented, you might get their entire day's earnings in cash, you might get their entire week's earnings, and that person is a lot less likely than me to actually report that crime. There's no reason for me not to report the crime, but for an undocumented person, there are a lot of reasons. Val mentioned just general fear of law enforcement, coming from their experiences in their home countries. Of course, in this country, they're afraid of law enforcement because of the deportation issue. And not only does that make people less likely to go to the police when they've been victims, it also keeps people trapped in abusive relationships and in victim trends. My program at the Esperanza Center Client Services, we have a case manager who works exclusively with undocumented, or rather immigrant victims of crime. And we see this all the time. People who come to us because they haven't gone to the police first because they're afraid that they might be deported. Oftentimes someone's abuser is a US citizen or someone with some sort of documentation, and their victim is not. And so they wonder whose side the police is going to take. We also recently worked with a woman who had been the victim of exploitation. Someone had been calling and texting and emailing her, letting her know that they were aware of the fact that she and her family were undocumented, and that if she didn't pay them money, they would report them to immigration, have them deported back to El Salvador, where they'd be murdered by the gangs. This woman ended up paying, I think, around $15,000 to this person before she thought to go to the police, before she built up the courage to go to the police. In a lot of cases, the crimes that undocumented people are committing are crimes that they're almost forced to commit based on the structures of our society. So in the United States, if you live in one of 12 different states, including Maryland, as an undocumented person, you are lucky enough to be able to get a driver's license in that state, which means that every time you get behind the wheel of a car, you're not committing a crime. But if you live in any of the other 38 states in this country, you still have to go to the grocery store, you still have to go to work, you have to take your kids to school, and if you're not lucky enough to live in a major metropolitan area where you can rely on public transportation, you have to drive, which means that every single time you get behind the wheel, you're committing a crime. And a lot of people end up in immigration detention for that simple fact. They get pulled over for driving without a license. So the next thing I'd like to talk to you about that we hear is the negative impact that undocumented immigrants have on the American economy, specifically on American laborers. And it is true, a lot of undocumented people come to the United States to work, but this is one side of the story that you hear very often, but you don't hear the other side of the story. The other side is, yes, if 100,000 people move to a certain area, there is more competition for jobs, but there's also 100,000 more consumers in that area, 100,000 people buying gas, paying for other services, paying for utilities, driving the economy, creating jobs. In a lot of places, undocumented immigrants are between 2 and 4 times more likely to start a business than American citizens. Businesses that often end up employing American citizens. And then, of course, you have the tax revenue that undocumented people contribute. Across the United States, undocumented people contribute $11.7 billion each year in state and local taxes. In the state of Maryland, that number is $332 million. And these are taxes that they are paying on their very, very low-wage jobs. There are a lot of studies out there that show that if they had access to better employment, if they had status, these numbers would go through the roof. Ooh. Well, we'll see if that comes back. That's too bad. This next slide was really important to have. All right, we're just going to keep going. So, there we go. All right, so in the United States, as Val mentioned, this last narrative that I'm going to talk about is that when we talk about undocumented immigration in this country, or undocumented immigrants, we kind of talk about them as if they're a discrete, separate chunk of our society that could be somehow easily isolated and removed from the United States. Of the 11 million undocumented immigrants in America, I want you to just take a few guesses at what these numbers mean. So there is one characteristic that 58% of these undocumented people have. So take 20 seconds and just jot down, what do you think that might be? 58% of them. That is, I believe, about 6.4 million people share this characteristic. Everybody have their answer? That number, or that characteristic, is that they've been living in the United States for 10 or more years. 15% of people share this characteristic. I'll give you another 10 seconds to think about what that might be. That shared characteristic is that they've been in the United States for 20 plus years, and that's almost 2 million people that we're talking about. So next, 33% of these undocumented people share this in common. I'll give you another 5 seconds. That number is that they are the parents of US citizen children. And actually, that number is not just that they are parents. These are people who are currently living with US citizen children. The number of people with US citizen children who are no longer children is actually larger. This number, 3.63 million people, are people who have a US citizen child and whose child is still under 18, which is to say still dependent on their parents. And just to give you the scope of that, that means that there are 4.1 million US citizen children, people who are under the age of 18, who have at least one undocumented parent. That number, 4.1 million, is larger than the populations of, I believe, 20 of our states. So these are not small chunks of people that we are talking about. In the state of Maryland, that number, 88,150, is the number of US citizen children in Maryland with one undocumented, at least one undocumented parent. So like I said, we talk about undocumented people as if they are, some discrete segment of our society, but they're really not. These people are your neighbors, these people are your coworkers, for many of us, our relatives or our significant others. And these people are people who have children who are born in the United States. So every time we talk about policies that impact undocumented people, what I would love to hear in the next breath is the impact that those policies will have on those 4 million United States citizens. These are people who are not citizens of any other country, people who will not be able to go to other countries if their parents are deported, people who are going to grow up in the United States. And when you have an undocumented parent, that means that you have at least one parent that is restricted to a job that pays you less than minimum wage. You have one parent that's hesitant to go to law enforcement. You have one parent that's afraid to take you to school or afraid to take you to the doctor. You have a parent who's forced to break the law every single time they have to drive to the grocery store to buy food for you. So that's another piece that I think that is missing from our national discourse about undocumented immigrants. And then the last thing I'll talk about is the gift that undocumented people bring to the United States. And this is not even to talk about the fact that the United States is, of course, as we know, a nation of immigrants. This country is built by immigrants, fueled by immigrants, and continues to be that. I'm talking about what's happening still today in the United States, and there's maybe no better place to make this argument than Baltimore. So Baltimore is a city that I think in its heyday held about 900,000 people. Today that number is in the 600,000s. And you don't have to go too far from the Inner Harbor to see what effect that's had on our city. You can go to places where you will find completely deserted blocks, nothing but vacant row homes. And then you can go to some places like Highlandtown in Patterson area, in Patterson Park area, Greektown, and you don't see the same thing there. You see every house full, you see new businesses, you see people walking around, you see economic life and vitality, and that's something that undocumented immigrants bring to the United States. Immigrants in general, but including undocumented immigrants. Often they move into some of the most unsafe and rundown neighborhoods, turn them around, and in fact, you can see this happening in Highlandtown. When I first moved to Baltimore 5 years ago, you could see this happening, and now because the neighborhood is so nice, you see different businesses moving in. You don't just see the bodegas on the corner, now you see Pilates studios and really, really fancy barbershops that you know would not have been there 10 or 15 years ago were it not for what undocumented immigrants had done to that community. So they revitalize our neighborhoods, they bring new businesses, they breathe life into our economies, and they increase our tax base. So on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Catalina, who will be able to talk to you a little more about what Baltimore does to help its undocumented population. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for your time and your interest in immigration. As an immigrant myself, I'm really grateful that I am able to do what I love. This is very personal to me as the director of the Office of Immigrant Affairs, but also I'm grateful that I live in a city, in an area that not only welcomed me, but embraced me. So through my job, I'm trying to transmit that to other communities. So today I'm going to talk to you about the role of the Mayor's Office of Immigrant and Multicultural Affairs, and I'm going to talk to you about the Safe City Baltimore initiative. So as Eric mentioned, Baltimore City's immigrant population has brought a lot of energy and resilience to our city. Our office was created in 2014 to work with the immigrant community, the growing immigrant community in our city. Currently, we have 8% of the population in Baltimore City is immigrant, which represents a 70% increase in the last 10 years. This is actually helping with the decline of the population in the city of Baltimore. Our role is to advise the mayor, city council, city agencies on matters related to immigrant and refugee communities. We also serve as a source of information for public and private entities, anything from demographics, policies, messaging, best practices, outreach strategies, and more. We also work to improve city services for immigrants by removing barriers related to language and culture. We do this by community building. We work a lot with churches, nonprofit organizations such as Esperanza Center, community groups. We try to be the eyes and ears of immigrants on the ground, and through that, to inform processes and services to improve services that the city provides to immigrant communities. We also try to respond to the needs of the community impacted by federal policies. And with this, I wanted to highlight the fact that many people tend to think that local governments should not be involved in federal policies, on federal matters. The reality is that those federal policies are impacting our city on the ground. When children are not going to school because their parents are being deported, that is impacting us as a city. When businesses are closing because they're afraid to be deported, that is impacting our economy. When homes are being foreclosed and we have a vacant property, when children end up in foster care. So immigration, as many people tend to think it's a federal matter, it is not. It is a very local matter, and we take it very serious. And so in 2017, early 2017, following the executive order by President Trump, we received a lot of calls from the community regarding the increase of immigration enforcement and arrests in our city. In exercising our convening power, we brought together legal service providers and community advocates to learn about what was happening on the ground. These folks serve as our tentacles, as our eyes and ears on the ground, so we really needed to know what was happening. And so through that, we wanted to know what was the need, what was the current capacity at the time, what were the gaps. And it was through that process that we learned that existing legal services for immigrants were at capacity, such as the ones in Esperanza Center. But most importantly, detained defense. So legal services for once a person has been arrested were almost non-existent. And so with this in mind, we exactly knew where the greatest need was. And in April 2017, our office launched the Safe City Baltimore initiative in partnership with Open Society Institute Baltimore to respond to the increase of immigration customs enforcement and arrests in our city. By August of 2017, we had exceeded our fundraising goal. The fund had been supported by OSI Baltimore, of course, NE Casey Foundation, Baltimore Community Foundation, the Vera Institute of Justice, the City of Baltimore, and individuals who really wanted to help their fellow neighbors in response to the federal government. The initiative funds local efforts and nonprofits to deliver 3 levels of service. And this was identified through the process and working with our community partners. 1, educate communities about their rights. We know for sure there is a sector of population that will not have any recourse. And so the only way to protect themselves is to know about their rights, what to do if they're reported, where should their children go, how to prepare if their home is going to be foreclosed. The second level of service is to increase access to legal counsel on the preventative side. And so funding organizations like Esperanza Center to help immigrants understand the legal process. And many of them may not have access to an attorney because they don't have the money or because they don't understand this complex immigration process brought up by Heather, right? The T visa, the U visa. Some of them may be viable for an immigration relief, but because of the lack of money or because they don't understand the process, they don't know that they could qualify. And lastly, and most importantly, provide legal counsel for those who have been detained by ICE. This initiative is important to us because we know that 81% of detained immigrants in Baltimore has no legal representation. 81%. And those with a lawyer are 4 times more likely to get a successful outcome case. So if you are poor, you're more likely to be deported. At the time, in mid-2017, we knew that the arrests of immigrants with a non-criminal record had increased 150% from the year prior. And I bet that those numbers have increased by now. And I'm thinking about the case of one of our constituents who was arrested in early 2017. Mr. Paukar was arrested on his way to the pharmacy. His crime was to fail to show up in front of an immigration judge 15 years ago. That's correct. So this notion that we are arresting people who are violent criminals is false. Many people do not have a criminal record and have failed an immigration administrative process, and that is their crime. Access to due process, including legal services, is the ultimate line of defense for our families. You know, oftentimes we get asked at our office, how can we help? What do we do? You know, having an attorney can mean staying with your family or leaving the country. That is the ultimate line of defense at the moment. We know that by having access to legal counsel, we can protect our families and prevent the ripple effects of deportation, as many of our constituents own homes, own businesses, pay taxes, are building, and in some cases renovating neighborhoods in the city of Baltimore. So we are aware that they're bringing a lot of resilience and energy to our city, and we want to make sure that we're protecting them and their families. So by the end of last year, we announced the grantees of our initiative, and one particular organization that was not relatively known to Baltimore and that specializes on deportation defense was recruited, and that is CARE Coalition, Capital Area Immigrants' Right Coalition. And so we essentially had to recruit them to focus in the city of Baltimore to provide legal representation once a person has been detained and transferred to ICE facilities, to the jails. But some of the members that were funded through our initiative are Catholic Charities of Esperanza Center, which will provide legal consultations about immigrants' rights, legal representation to access available immigrant remedies, and family safety planning. Pro Bono Resource Center of Maryland will provide consultations and referral services at the Baltimore Immigration Court and recruit and coordinate pro bono attorneys. The University of Maryland Carey School of Law Immigration Clinic will provide representation in immigration bond hearings and develop a statewide immigrant legal defense fund. And CARE Coalition, as I mentioned earlier, will provide legal representation for those who have been arrested by Immigration Customs Enforcement. Combined, the Safe City Baltimore initiative will assist 900 people at various stages in their immigration process over the next 2 years. We are one of 16 cities in the country with a legal fund. We're committed to legal representation, as we believe that it is the fairest and most efficient way to bring order to the complex process of immigration and the increase of immigration enforcement. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm available.